On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, the hostilities ceased. Exactly 100 years ago today, World War I had been raging for 4 long years, leaving 9 million soldiers dead, 21 million wounded. Germany, France, Russia, and Great Britain each lost about 1 million soldiers. The United States lost about 160,000, just about twice as many as those who died in Vietnam. By the end of the war, Germany was running out of soldiers and supplies, and they knew that an invasion was imminent. And so on November 11th, 1918, the leaders of Germany and the Allied forces met in a railroad car in France and signed an armistice agreement, a temporary ceasing of hostilities. But for all intents and purposes, World War I was over. Then the remembrances began. About a year later, on November 11th, it was declared by many countries as Armistice Day. It became a federal holiday in the United States in 1938, and in the aftermath of World War II and the Korean War, the name was changed to Veterans Day. So today is a day that is dedicated to American veterans of all of our wars. In Great Britain and in other European countries, 2 minutes of silence are observed at 11 a.m. every single year on November 11th. So I want you to just take a moment and think about their sacrifice as you close your eyes. Close your eyes and picture this scene. In Flanders fields the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky the larks sing bravely, still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. We've been observing this holiday for 100 years, and so today we do pause and we remember the significance of sacrifice. And when veterans make their sacrifice, they are giving up their own security for the security of others. They put themselves in harm's way to protect family members and friends and neighbors and people they will never, ever meet. But not every veteran is a fighter. There's one, Desmond Doss. He was a devout Christian. He refused to hold a weapon, and he refused to work on the Sabbath. But he enlisted in the army in World War II because he believed in the cause, but he volunteered to be a combat medic, and all through training refused to brandish a weapon. At first, the army wanted nothing to do with him, and the members of his battalion considered him a pest. They would throw their shoes at him every time he kneeled to pray. But at Okinawa in the spring of 1945, Doss and his company faced a grueling task. They had to climb a steep and jagged cliff where they were faced with thousands of armed Japanese soldiers. Under heavy fire, Doss climbed that ridge and crawled from wounded soldier to wounded soldier, dragging them to safety. He was praying the whole time, Lord, please help me get one more. In the end, he saved 75 men over 12 hours without ever firing a shot. Now, while I am grateful to those who have served in our military, I also realize that not all of us have that opportunity or are called to that type of service. But I think we're all still called to make sacrifices. Here at Wesley Freedom, Our mission is to make disciples of Jesus Christ who share the story of God's grace. And we define a disciple as somebody who belongs to Jesus, becomes like Jesus, and serves like Jesus. And in order to do this, we are called to make sacrifices, to fully follow Jesus as a disciple. To declare that Jesus is Lord means that we're called to sacrifice everything else that is not Lord. And if Jesus is Lord, then nothing else can be. We're called to belong. And to belong, we must be willing to make the church our family. And such genuine belonging is the only thing that can fill the void that is in all of our lives. I mean, I look around at people. I was just talking to somebody today. I look around at people who are living their lives staring through a screen. I catch myself doing that once in a while. And just think, what are they looking for? What's the void that's missing, the community that's missing that they try to catch up on Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and all the others? However, it's in such committed belonging that we will experience the most extreme sacrifices. That's why I think Facebook is so popular, because we can feel like we have a sense of community, but we don't have to sacrifice anything because we make everything look wonderful. But to belong to Jesus and to belong to a community means that we are called to make worship a priority. And in our busy schedules, that means we have to sacrifice something else. Something else has to give way if we're going to make worship a priority. Also, Christians are called to belong to a human community, and in any community of people, sometimes we're going to be let down. So if we enter into that human community realizing that we are going to be let down by others, as well as we're going to let down other people, then we can remember that people can't satisfy all of our emotional needs. All that we can do is help one another become who God has created us to become. I'm one of those PBS kids. Say a PBS kid because PBS decided that my generation was so important. Not you boomers, not you millennials. The Gen X was so important they would create Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers. Yes, for me. And it was just, I was so overwhelmed when I got in college. I didn't realize this till I got in college. I was meeting with my advisor. I started out as a religion major. And I was meeting with my advisor, and his claim to fame is he went to seminary with Fred Rogers. Like the Mr. Rogers. I didn't know he was a Presbyterian minister, Mr. Rogers. But Mr. Rogers developed this entire children's program around this idea that everybody needed community. Everybody needed a neighborhood where people could be loved and where people could learn that they can love others. So what does it look like if we create a community that does that, that helps people realize that you belong in a neighborhood and you are loved? But just as important as being loved, you are capable of loving others. But in order to create such a neighborhood, what sacrifices are we willing to make? But belonging is just the beginning, because we're also called to become like Jesus. We are reminded that we are the only thing in all of God's creation that becomes something other than what it is. I mean, a cat doesn't become anything, it's just a cat. A cow doesn't become anything, it's just a cow. Well, cows do become... Dan and I have this running joke about how wonderful God is, because God takes yucky green stuff and through a cow makes delicious stuff. I'll let you say that part. So I'll just giggle. But they don't become anything else. But we are the only thing that from birth to death, we are in a process of becoming something more. That's what humanity in our life is about. We are to spend our lifetimes growing our souls so that we can become more and more who God intends us to be, both for ourselves, but more importantly, for others. And to become what God calls us and intends for us to be requires change. And trust me, the one thing that I've learned as 27 years in pastoral ministry, you all love change. Not. And don't worry, it's not just you. Nobody likes to change. Because we are continually going through a process, however, change is inevitable. And change requires us making sacrifices. Sacrifices so that we can become who God has created us to be. For ourselves and for others. And that whole process of belonging and becoming leads us to one thing. It leads us to being able to serve like Jesus. To serve like Jesus means to do those things that no one else wants to do, like washing your disciples' feet and forgiving your enemies and loving those who persecute you. It also means giving back. Giving back to our church, giving back to our community through our time and our generosity. As Sherry said, it requires sacrifice. The disciple Mark, one of those friends who followed Jesus around and also wrote down the things that he experienced with Jesus, gives us a wonderful example of sacrifice that Sherry highlighted. It's in Mark chapter 12, verses 38 through 44. I want you to follow along as I read this account that Mark shares. Mark writes, "As Jesus taught, he said, 'Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation.' He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, 'Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance. She, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on.'" Just another example of all giving some, and in this case, one giving all. This story of the widow's mite is a story of sacrifice and trust. I mean, no doubt, every resident in Jerusalem would have known this impoverished widow. See, being a widow was also kind of putting you on the outside of religious life. So people liked to keep an eye on those they considered to be outside. And I'm sure there are those with compassion who worried on her behalf, that after watching her make her gift, they may have worried that knowing her, she may not have enough to live on. And if you go back to the verses I started with, and even a little further in the Gospel of Mark in this 12th chapter, it contains a critique that Jesus lays out of those worldly temple authorities. Kind of hurts when he talks about people walking around in opulent robes. But they're strutting around in their lavish robes and gorging themselves on banquets and even devouring widows' houses. And then along comes this widow who very well may have been living in a house that they had devoured, who gives all that she has, giving up her very last coin, placing herself in abject poverty. And as strange as it may seem to our prudent and cautious selves, she decides that having absolutely nothing is enough. It reminds me of a story I read by Reverend Jack Stott. He was the former president of McCormick Theological Seminary, and he tells this story of his early days in local church ministry. And during those early days, the chairperson of his stewardship committee came to him and said, Pastor, we were opening the envelopes that contain the estimate of giving, the pledge cards, and we noticed that when we came to the card of Mamie Cades, we got concerned. Because when we saw the amount that she had pledged to give, we knew she couldn't afford it. Now, they based this because she lived in a house that needed a lot of repairs, but without actually asking her, they just all figured she was poor. So the committee decided that the pastor, Jack, should go and talk to her. They thought he should be the one to tell her that she shouldn't give this gift to the church. And so with some trepidation, this young and inexperienced pastor went to her ramshackled house and knocked on her door, and with great hospitality, she invited him into her parlor, served him lemonade, and then he told her of the stewardship committee's concern. And you could just see the color and life drain from her face. And she said to him, "Would you take away my joy? Would you take away my joy?" It's this modern day widow's mite parable that reminds me that in her sacrifice, Mamie found joy. In her sacrifice, she found joy. I want you to think about that, because in a little over a week, we're going to be gathering around our tables. Are they lavish banquets? Maybe. For Thanksgiving. And I just think it's an excellent opportunity for us to remember that we do have enough to share. We have the opportunity to look back and count our blessings and realize and appreciate how fortunate we are. We have the opportunity to realize that our possessions are not the source of our blessings. It's our relationship with the living and loving God. And whatever we have in terms of life or material wealth, all of it is a gracious gift from God. And it simply has to be enough. Enough to live on and enough to share. Let us pray.